A boxing legend walked into one of the most dangerous places on earth and said something that nobody expected. What Manny Pacquiao told Kim Jong-un left an entire nation speechless and changed everything. You're about to discover how a fighter from the Philippines became the only person to speak truth to one of the world's most feared dictators. How a simple message about faith and humanity penetrated the most isolated country on the planet, and how one conversation sparked something that nobody saw coming. Stay until the end, because what happened after this meeting will restore your faith in the power of courage and compassion. It was the spring of 2018 when one of the most unexpected diplomatic encounters in modern history took place. Manny Pacquiao, the legendary Filipino boxer, senator, and devout Christian, received an invitation that shocked the entire world. He was invited to visit North Korea, officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, one of the most isolated and controlled nations on Earth, to meet with Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. The invitation came through unusual diplomatic channels. North Korea had been making rare overtures toward international engagement, including historic meetings with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and preparations for a summit with United States President Donald Trump. In this brief window of openness, someone in the North Korean government had suggested that bringing Manny Pacquiao, one of the most recognizable athletes in the world and a symbol of triumph over poverty, might create positive international attention for the regime. Manny Pacquiao was 59 years old at the time, long past his prime fighting years but still active in boxing and deeply involved in Philippine politics as a senator. More importantly, he had become known worldwide not just for his incredible boxing career, with 62 wins, including 39 knockouts, but for his outspoken Christian faith that had transformed his life from poverty and violence to purpose and service. When the invitation arrived through back channels involving Chinese diplomats and Philippine government officials, Pacquiao's advisors were divided. Some saw it as a dangerous political stunt that could backfire terribly. North Korea was known for detaining foreigners on flimsy charges, for controlling every aspect of visitors' experiences, for using international guests as propaganda tools. Others saw it as a unique opportunity for humanitarian engagement, a chance to bring a message of hope to one of the darkest places on earth. Pacquiao spent weeks praying about the decision. He consulted with his wife Jinky, with his pastor, with close friends and political allies. He knew that visiting North Korea would be controversial, that critics would accuse him of legitimizing a brutal dictatorship, that the trip could be dangerous. But something in his spirit told him that this was an opportunity that might never come again, a chance to be a light in darkness, to speak truth where truth was forbidden. He accepted the invitation with conditions. He would come not as a politician but as a boxer and as a man of faith. He would not engage in propaganda activities for the regime. He would speak honestly if given the opportunity, and he would bring a message about God, about hope, about the dignity of every human life. The North Korean officials, eager for the publicity that Pacquiao's visit would generate, agreed to his terms, probably not fully understanding what they were agreeing to. The journey to North Korea began in Manila, where Pacquiao boarded a private jet provided by a wealthy Chinese businessman who supported the diplomatic initiative. He was accompanied by a small team including his head of security, a trusted advisor, a documentary filmmaker who would record the trip, and a translator who spoke both English and Korean. The Philippine government had been notified but maintained public distance from the visit, wanting plausible deniability if things went wrong. They flew first to Beijing, where they spent a night and received final briefings from Chinese officials who had helped arrange the visit. The Chinese emphasized the importance of being careful with words, of not offending their North Korean hosts, of understanding that this was a delicate diplomatic situation. Pacquiao listened politely but had already made up his mind about what he would say, if given the chance. The flight from Beijing to Pyongyang took just over 2 hours. As they approached North Korean airspace, the mood in the plane became tense. Everyone knew they were entering one of the most controlled, most surveilled, most dangerous places on Earth. Below them, the landscape changed from the bright lights and development of China to the darkness of North Korea, where electricity was scarce, and most of the country lived in poverty, while the regime spent billions on nuclear weapons and monuments to the Kim family. They landed at Pyongyang Sunan International Airport on a gray morning. The airport was almost empty, eerily quiet compared to the bustling airports Pacquiao was used to. They were met by a delegation of North Korean officials in military uniforms and dark suits, all wearing the mandatory pins showing the faces of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the grandfather and father of the current leader. The officials were formally polite, but cold. They checked every item of luggage, examined every device, made it clear that everything was being watched and controlled. Pacquiao and his team were driven in a convoy of black Mercedes sedans through the streets of Pyongyang, the showcase capital that the regime used to impress visitors while hiding the poverty and suffering in the rest of the country. The streets were wide and mostly empty. Giant monuments and statues of the Kim family dominated the skyline. Buildings were gray and uniform. The few people visible on the streets moved with purpose, never lingering, never gathering in groups. Everything felt staged, artificial, like a movie set rather than a real city. Pacquiao looked out the window and felt a deep sadness for the people living under such oppression. They were taken to the Koryo Hotel, one of the few hotels in Pyongyang that accepted foreign visitors. The hotel was large but dated, stuck in the aesthetic of the 1970s. Their rooms were clean but obviously bugged with listening devices. The team was warned not to discuss anything sensitive in their rooms, to assume that everything they said was being monitored. That first night, they were taken to a state dinner in their honor. The room was filled with government officials, military officers, and carefully selected citizens who were trusted by the regime. The food was surprisingly good. Multiple courses of Korean dishes served with elaborate ceremony. But the atmosphere was stiff and formal. Everyone watching everyone else, no one relaxed. Pacquiao was seated at the head table, but Kim Jong-un was not present at this dinner. A government minister gave a speech welcoming Pacquiao to North Korea, praising his boxing achievements, calling him a champion of the people. Pacquiao was expected to give a short response speech. His advisors had prepared careful diplomatic remarks that thanked the hosts and talked about sports bringing people together. But when Pacquiao stood to speak, he set aside the prepared remarks. He thanked his hosts for the invitation, then said something that made the translators pause. He said that he came to North Korea not to talk about boxing, but to talk about something more important, about the power of faith, about how God had transformed his life from poverty and violence to purpose and peace. The room went completely silent. Nobody in North Korea spoke publicly about God. Religion was forbidden, replaced by worship of the Kim family. The government officials looked uncomfortable. The translator hesitated before translating, wondering if he should soften the words. But Pacquiao continued, speaking gently but clearly about how his Christian faith had given him strength, had taught him that every human being has value, that love is more powerful than fear. He said he hoped to share that message with everyone he met in North Korea. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Some officials looked angry, others confused, others perhaps curious. The dinner ended shortly after with tension in the air. Pacquiao's advisor quietly told him that he might have just ended the visit before the main event, that he might have offended their hosts too much. But Pacquiao was at peace. He had come to speak truth, and he had spoken it. The next morning, they were informed that the meeting with Kim Jong-un was still scheduled. Apparently, the supreme leader wanted to meet the boxer who had dared to talk about God in his atheist state. They were driven to one of Kim's palaces on the outskirts of Pyongyang, a massive complex surrounded by walls and guards, isolated from the city. The security was intense. They went through multiple checkpoints, were searched repeatedly, had their phones and cameras confiscated. They were led through marble hallways decorated with paintings glorifying the Kim dynasty. Everything was excessive, ornate, a display of power and wealth while the North Korean people starved. Finally, they were brought to a large reception room. They waited for over an hour, a power play to make them understand who was in control. Then Kim Jong-un entered with his entourage of advisors and military officials. He was younger than Pacquiao expected, only 34 years old, but already showing the weight gain and health problems that came from excessive living. He wore his trademark dark suit and had his distinctive haircut that no one else in North Korea was allowed to copy. Kim approached Pacquiao with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They shook hands for the cameras. Kim spoke through a translator, welcoming Pacquiao to his country, saying he was a fan of boxing, that he had watched Pacquiao's greatest fights. The conversation began with small talk about sports, about training, about the discipline required to be a champion. They sat across from each other at a long table. Kim's officials sat on one side, Pacquiao's small team on the other. Tea was served in expensive china. The atmosphere was formal and controlled. Kim asked questions about specific fights, about Pacquiao's rivalry with Floyd Mayweather, about his training regimen. Pacquiao answered politely but briefly, waiting for the right moment. Then Kim asked a question that opened the door. He asked what had made Pacquiao so successful, what was the secret to his greatness. This was the opportunity Pacquiao had been waiting for. He looked directly at Kim Jong-un and said something that would echo far beyond that room. Pacquiao said that his success didn't come from his fists or his speed or his training. He said his success came from the day he surrendered his life to Jesus Christ, the day he stopped living for himself and started living for something greater. He said that before his conversion, he had everything, money, fame, power, but he was empty inside, lost, destroying himself with gambling and alcohol and pride. The translator was translating in real time, and you could see the discomfort spreading through the North Korean officials. This was not what was supposed to happen. Foreign guests didn't preach Christianity to the supreme leader. But Pacquiao continued, his voice gentle but firm, speaking with the authority of someone who had lived through transformation. He said that finding God had taught him that real power isn't about controlling others, it's about serving others. Real strength isn't about making people fear you. It's about loving people even when they don't deserve it. Real greatness isn't about building monuments to yourself. It's about building up the people around you. The room was absolutely silent. Kim Jong-un's smile had faded. He was staring at Pacquiao with an expression that was hard to read. Anger, curiosity, something else. His officials looked ready to end the meeting, to remove this guest who was breaking every protocol. But Kim raised his hand slightly, a signal to let Pacquiao continue speaking. Pacquiao then did something even bolder. He looked at Kim Jong-un and said that he knew Kim was raised to believe he was almost like a god to his people, raised to think his family was destined to rule, raised in isolation and power. But Pacquiao said he wanted Kim to know a truth that could set him free, that there is only one true God, and Kim wasn't him. And that was actually good news because it meant Kim didn't have to carry the impossible burden of being a god. Can you imagine the courage it took to say that? Leave a comment below about what you would have done in that situation. Pacquiao said that God loved Kim Jong-un, not because of his power or position, but simply because he was a human being created in God's image. He said that God offered forgiveness for everything, offered a new start, offered freedom from the prison of having to maintain an image of perfection and control. He said that accepting this love didn't make someone weak. It made them truly strong. The silence in the room was total. This was unprecedented. Nobody spoke to Kim Jong-un like this. Nobody challenged the foundational mythology of North Korea, the idea that the Kim family was divine. And yet here was Manny Pacquiao, a boxer from the Philippines, speaking these truths with love and respect but absolute clarity. Then Pacquiao did something that shocked everyone even more. He stood up from his chair, walked around the table and approached Kim Jong-un directly. The security guards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But Pacquiao raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. He stopped in front of Kim and said he wanted to pray for him, if Kim would allow it. For a long moment, Kim said nothing. His face was unreadable. His officials looked panicked. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Kim gave a slight nod. Pacquiao placed his hand gently on Kim's shoulder and began to pray. He prayed in English while the translator converted his words to Korean. He prayed for wisdom for Kim, for compassion, for the people of North Korea who were suffering, for peace, for transformation, for God's love to penetrate the darkness. Tears were streaming down Pacquiao's face as he prayed. Some of his team members were crying too. Even some of the North Korean officials looked moved, though they tried to hide it. And Kim Jong-un, the man who never showed weakness, who never showed emotion, had tears in his eyes. When the prayer ended, Kim sat there for a moment, not speaking. Then he said something in Korean that the translator seemed reluctant to translate. Pacquiao asked what he had said. The translator finally whispered that Kim had said, "No one has ever spoken to me like this. No one has ever told me I don't have to be a god." The meeting that was supposed to last 30 minutes went on for 3 hours. Kim asked questions about Christianity, about forgiveness, about how someone with blood on their hands could ever be made clean. Pacquiao shared his own testimony, how he had hurt people, how he had wasted years of his life, how God had forgiven him and changed him completely. Kim talked about the pressure he felt, the impossible expectations, how he had been shaped since childhood to be what his country needed him to be. He spoke about his education in Switzerland, where he had seen glimpses of freedom and normalcy. He asked if it was possible for someone like him, responsible for so much suffering, to ever find peace. Pacquiao told him the story of the Apostle Paul, a man who had persecuted and killed Christians, but became one of the greatest leaders of the early church after encountering Jesus. He told him that it's never too late, that God's love reaches anyone who opens their heart to receive it, that transformation is always possible. What happened in that room was never supposed to happen. The North Korean government had invited Pacquiao for propaganda purposes, to show a famous athlete visiting their country, to gain some international goodwill. Instead, they got a Bible study session where their supreme leader heard the gospel preached directly to him. When the meeting finally ended, Kim did something unusual. He personally walked Pacquiao and his team to their vehicles, something he almost never did for foreign visitors. At the car, Kim shook Pacquiao's hand and said through the translator that he would think about everything they had discussed. He said he couldn't make promises about changing the country overnight, but that Pacquiao had given him much to consider. Pacquiao gave Kim a gift before leaving, a Bible in Korean that he had brought specifically for this purpose. Kim accepted it and held it for a moment, looking at it like it was something dangerous and precious at the same time. Then he thanked Pacquiao and went back inside the palace. The drive back to the hotel was quiet. Everyone was processing what had just happened. Pacquiao's advisor said that in 30 years of diplomatic work, he had never seen anything like it. The documentary filmmaker said he had captured most of it on camera, but wasn't sure if the North Koreans would allow them to leave with the footage. That night, officials came to their hotel and confiscated the cameras and all recording devices. They said it was standard procedure, that the equipment would be returned at the airport. Pacquiao's team assumed that meant all footage of the meeting would be erased, but Pacquiao wasn't concerned about the footage. He had accomplished what he came to do. He had spoken truth in love. He had planted seeds that only God could make grow. The next morning, they were taken on a tour of Pyongyang that the government had arranged, visits to monuments and museums that glorified the Kim regime. Pacquiao went through the motions, but his mind was on the meeting, praying for Kim, praying for the North Korean people. At one point during the tour, their guide, a young woman who was undoubtedly a loyal party member, asked him a question when they were briefly separated from the main group. She asked in quiet English what Pacquiao had talked about with the supreme leader that made the meeting so long. Pacquiao looked at her and said simply that he had shared about God's love. The young woman's eyes went wide, and she looked around nervously to make sure no one had heard. Then she whispered that her grandmother had been a Christian before it became forbidden, that she still remembered prayers from childhood. Pacquiao's heart broke for this young woman living in such oppression. Before they parted, Pacquiao quickly told her that God had not forgotten North Korea, that he loved every person there, that nothing could separate them from that love. The woman had tears in her eyes as she returned to the official tour group. It was a brief moment, but it reinforced for Pacquiao why he had come. On the final day, as they were preparing to leave for the airport, they received an unexpected message. Kim Jong-un wanted to see Pacquiao one more time privately before he left. This time there was no entourage, no officials, no translators except one trusted aide. They met in a smaller, more informal room. Kim looked tired, like he hadn't slept. He told Pacquiao that he had been reading the Bible, that he had many questions, that everything he had been taught his whole life was being challenged. He asked if Pacquiao truly believed that even someone like him could be forgiven, could be changed. Pacquiao said absolutely yes. He said that the thief on the cross next to Jesus was forgiven in his last moments of life. He said that God's grace is bigger than our worst sins. He said that the first step is just to admit you need help, to admit you can't do it alone, to ask God for mercy. Kim was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Pacquiao would never forget. He said, "I want to believe what you're saying is true, "But I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'm strong enough to change everything." Pacquiao responded that strength doesn't come from yourself. It comes from surrendering to God, letting Him be strong through you. They prayed together one more time. This time, Kim prayed too, hesitantly, simply, asking God if He was real to show him, asking for help to understand, asking for forgiveness. It wasn't a dramatic conversion moment like in the movies, but it was real. It was a crack in the armor that had been built around Kim's heart since childhood. When they parted, Kim shook Pacquiao's hand and said that regardless of what happened, he would never forget this visit, never forget what Pacquiao had told him. Pacquiao said he would pray for Kim every day for the rest of his life. Then they went their separate ways, the boxer returning to freedom and the dictator returning to his palace prison. The flight out of North Korea felt surreal. As they crossed back into Chinese airspace, there was a collective exhale. They had made it out safely. More importantly, they had accomplished something that seemed impossible. At the Beijing airport, waiting to board the flight back to Manila, they were surprised when their confiscated equipment was returned to them. Even more surprising, the footage was intact. None of it had been erased. When Pacquiao returned to the Philippines, he faced immediate criticism. Political opponents accused him of legitimizing a dictator, of being used for propaganda. Human rights organizations questioned why he would visit one of the world's worst oppressors of human rights. International media was divided, some praising his courage, others condemning his naivety. But Pacquiao didn't defend himself publicly. He simply said that he had been called to go, that he had shared what he was called to share, and that he was trusting God with the results. He refused to release the full footage of the private conversations, saying that some things were sacred and between the people in that room and God. In the months that followed, there were small signs that something had shifted. North Korea's rhetoric softened slightly in international statements. There were reports, unconfirmed, of some political prisoners being released. Kim Jong-un's interactions with South Korea and with President Trump seemed slightly less hostile, slightly more open. Were these changes connected to Pacquiao's visit? Impossible to know for certain, but those who were in that room believed something significant had happened. More concrete were the reports that began filtering out through defectors and secret church networks. The Bible that Pacquiao had given Kim had not been destroyed as expected. Kim had reportedly been reading it, had asked questions about Christianity to trusted advisors. Some sources claimed he had even allowed secret Christian house churches to operate with less persecution, though this remained dangerous and hidden. A year after the visit, Pacquiao received a letter through diplomatic channels. It was from Kim Jong-un, written in Korean and translated to English. The letter thanked Pacquiao for his visit, for his words, for his prayers. It said that Kim was still struggling with everything they had discussed, still trying to reconcile his upbringing with the truths Pacquiao had shared. It said he was trying to be better, trying to think differently about his role and his country. It didn't promise dramatic changes, but it acknowledged that seeds had been planted. Pacquiao framed that letter and kept it in his office. He continued to pray daily for Kim Jong-un and for the people of North Korea. He would tell close friends that he believed God was working in that dark place, that nothing is impossible for God, that even the hardest heart can be softened. The story of what Manny Pacquiao told Kim Jong-un eventually became known in Christian circles around the world. It inspired others to pray for North Korea, to believe that transformation is possible even in the darkest places. Prayer groups formed specifically to intercede for the North Korean people and their leaders. Missionary organizations began preparing for the day when North Korea might open to the gospel. Pacquiao himself continued his boxing career for a few more years, then focused on his political work in the Philippines and on his ministry. He spoke often about his North Korea visit in churches and conferences, always careful not to share private details, but emphasizing the importance of speaking truth in love, of being bold for God, even in dangerous situations. The full impact of that visit may not be known for years or even decades. Kim Jong-un remains in power in North Korea. The country remains isolated and oppressive, but those who believe in the power of the gospel believe that the seeds planted that day are growing in the darkness, that God is at work even where he seems absent, that truth and love are more powerful than fear and oppression. What do you think happened in Kim Jong-un's heart after that meeting? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The story teaches us profound lessons that go beyond politics and international relations. It teaches us about courage, about being willing to speak truth even when it's dangerous, even when it might cost everything. Pacquiao could have played it safe, could have just talked about boxing and taken some photos and left. Instead, he risked his safety, his reputation, everything to share what he knew to be the most important truth. It teaches us that every person, no matter how powerful or how corrupted by power, is still a human being created in God's image, still reachable by God's love. It's easy to write off people like Kim Jong-un as monsters, as beyond redemption, but the gospel doesn't work that way. The gospel says there is always hope, always possibility for change, always love available. The story also teaches us about the power of personal encounter. All the sanctions, all the diplomatic pressure, all the military threats couldn't reach Kim Jong-un's heart the way one boxer sharing his testimony could. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell our story, share how God has changed us, and trust that He will use it. It reminds us that we are called to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute others, to see every person as someone God loves and died for. Pacquiao didn't go to North Korea to condemn Kim Jong-un. He went to tell him about God's love. That's the gospel. That's what changes hearts. The story also shows us that obedience to God often doesn't make sense to the world. Everyone thought Pacquiao was crazy to go, thought it was dangerous and pointless. But God's ways are not our ways. Sometimes we're called to do things that seem foolish or risky because God sees what we can't see, works in ways we can't predict. For those who wonder if one conversation can really make a difference in a place like North Korea, remember that transformation always starts with individuals. Kim Jong-un is one man, but he's a man with tremendous power over millions of lives. If God can change his heart, the ripple effects could be enormous, and even if Kim never changes, the seeds planted that day may bear fruit in ways we can't imagine, may inspire others, may be part of a larger work that God is doing. The story ultimately points us to the hope of the gospel, that no person is beyond reach, no place is beyond God's power, no darkness can overcome the light. North Korea seems like the most hopeless place on earth, but with God, there is always hope. As long as there are people willing to go, willing to speak, willing to love even the unlovable, God can work. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it challenged you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more incredible true stories of faith and courage. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that nothing is impossible with God, that we're all called to be bold witnesses regardless of the cost. And most importantly, let this story inspire you to be brave in your own life. You might not meet dictators, but you have opportunities every day to speak truth, to share your faith, to love people that society says are unlovable. Will you take those opportunities? Will you be like Manny Pacquiao, willing to risk everything to share what matters most? The seeds planted in that palace in Pyongyang are still growing. Only God knows what fruit they will bear. But one day, we may look back and see that a boxer from the Philippines speaking truth to a dictator was a turning point, was the beginning of something beautiful emerging from something dark. That's how God works, using ordinary people willing to be extraordinary in their faith. Manny Pacquiao walked into North Korea as a boxing champion. He walked out having fought the most important fight of his life, not with his fists, but with his words, not for a title, but for a soul. And in that palace, in that conversation, in those prayers, something shifted. The full story won't be known until eternity, but heaven was watching, angels were rejoicing, and the darkness trembled because light had invaded its domain. Never underestimate what God can do through one person completely surrendered to Him, willing to go anywhere, say anything, risk everything for the sake of the gospel. That's what Manny Pacquiao did. That's what left North Korea in complete silence. That's what might just change everything.